Can y'all hear me? Okay, and online, I'm good. Oh, that's like very loud. I'm gonna make it a little, maybe it's just me that feels loud. Anyway, so thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I had to reschedule. It was a bad flu season, and I blame this one. This is my daughter who is bringing home every germ known to man and building that immune system and giving it all to me and building my immune system. But anyway, so I thought I'd take us back to the beginning, since as Natalie mentioned, I was an undergraduate here, and this is me presenting my senior thesis that I did with Dan Swingley back in the day, I had this great plan. We had this great plan to look at language development in infants who were experiencing temporary hearing loss through middle ear infections, so chronic middle ear infections, and how that affected their phonological development, if it affected their phonological development. And what we found instead was that demographic factors, and specifically socioeconomic status, swamped every effect of hearing status that we could find. And so it was the strongest predictor of children's language development, specifically parents who were children of parents who had more education, were both faster at identifying words, more accurate at identifying words, and this related to their language development. And so this ultimately drove a lot of my, well, I won't say it was the single driver, but it was a factor that really got me interested in tackling this area head on. From there, I went into the clinical field, and I started working in speech pathology. I worked primarily in Title I schools, low-income schools. This is one of my classes, and then also in hospitals with I had a caseload that was primarily Medicaid patients, so primarily low-income individuals. And I was struck by sort of this duality where on average, these children tended to perform more poorly on language assessments, on reading skills, on kindergarten readiness, on all these different measures compared to their wealthier peers. However, I was struck at the same time by the individual differences amongst them, the different trajectories they seemed to be taking, the resiliencies they showed in the way they approached learning. And so these dual fascinations are largely what has driven my research program, where I'm interested both in socioeconomic disparities in development, but also in the vast diversity and heterogeneity of cognitive development, and how this impacts future learning. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. I purposely kind of chose sort of this provocative sort of headline because it reflects my evolving understanding of this area. So frequently when we talk about socioeconomic status and its effects on development, we tend to do so from what is called a deficit model, finding that lower SES children are underperforming their higher SES peers. And we're looking for the root cause of these difficulties. And this is largely where I started with a lot of my research. But in my clinical field, we have this phrase that is drilled into us to always be looking for whether it is a disorder or a difference, just a difference, due to some variation in environmental factors. And so this is where my work has taken a turn more recently, trying to understand SES-related differences as natural variation, as neural adaptations to heterogeneous early environments. And then trying to understand how we might be able to harness this knowledge in the education and clinical space. And finally, the last thing I'll talk about today is sort of where we take these two approaches together forward. And so how in developmental cognitive neuroscience, and I guess developmental psychology more broadly, can we embrace this diversity, this heterogeneity, this variability that I think is so essential to truly understanding the whole of neurocognitive development. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And so I'll start with, I guess, the problem. I talked a little bit about it, but I thought on my train ride up here, I'd look at Maryland, where I am coming from, and Pennsylvania, where we are now. So this is a chart of income-based achievement gaps in fourth grade reading scores, standardized tests given to all fourth graders. You can see the US national averages in the darkest colors, and then I've also plotted Maryland and Pennsylvania. And sort of the overwhelming takeaway from this graph is those lines are pretty flat and parallel, right? And so the disparities in literacy rates between children from higher income and lower income backgrounds. Sorry, FRPL is free and reduced price lunch. So children who are eligible for it typically live at less than 200% of the poverty line. So this is based on income. So these are largely unchanged over decades. You can also see the pandemic effect. Interestingly, where I am in Maryland, we are the 5th worst state for income achievement gaps. My neighbor DC is the worst. Y'all are doing better. PA is slightly above the average, the national average, but still got the gaps. So clearly this is a pressing problem, and we need to understand its precursors to try and affect change. And so I focus on language and literacy, one, because I think it's best, but also because the effect of SES on various domains of cognition is not uniform. So this graph on the left from Martha's work showing that the effect size of SES differences in language are almost double that of many other cognitive domains. And then some of my work comparing SES relationships with verbal and nonverbal measures of cognition. So there does seem to be a disproportionate effect on language and literacy skills. But these disparities don't just manifest in school age, they start very early. So there's research to suggest that these disparities in language development begin as early as the first year of life. Back to our unpublished data from my research here, they widen throughout early childhood and the preschool years. And ultimately culminate in large disparities by kindergarten entry. And then if we follow children even further than that, we can see that SES differences in preschool language skills can explain achievement gaps that we see in all sorts of domains. So reading, math, overall IQ, high school completion rates even. And so I'm very interested in language. It seems to be somewhere at the beginning. And so when I first started approaching this question, it was pretty clear what the proposed mechanism was. So these are all headlines from news articles during the first couple of years of my graduate studies. And everywhere you looked, there was a discussion of the 30 million word gap. So this is a phrase coined from a study from Hart and Risley in the early 90s that found disparities in children's language development were related to SES differences in how parents talk to their children, how much language they were exposed to in any given day. And so when that was aggregated over several years, it culminated in what was referred to as the 30 million word gap. And it spurred a lot of research and a lot of policy also. And so when I first approached this area, this is what I was seeing, that SES seemed to be, relating to the linguistic environment in some way, and that was influencing language development. But I wanted to know about the neural mechanisms that seem to intervene in that pathway. Presumably, if children's day-to-day experiences were shaping their cognitive development, then we should be able to measure something in their neural processing that mediated this relationship. And so the first study I'll tell you about was in collaboration with John Gabrielli at MIT and Meredith Rowe at Harvard. And we recruited a sample of children 4 to 6 years old, so kindergarten or pre-kindergarten, and all typically developing native English speakers, and importantly, from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. We pretty much span the socioeconomic range present in our area, as indexed here by parental education and total family income. Oh, and all of this data is available if anyone ever wants to look at it. I'm happy to share. And so what we did is we tried to measure children's real world language environments. Presumably this is what was having this influence. And so at the time we used this fancy new technology that is now pretty prevalent, but it's called LENA. It's the Language Environment Analysis System. And what it is a small audio recorder. It weighs about 2 ounces. Children wear it inside a specialized shirt pocket or a vest, and it records a whole day of their auditory experience from their perspective. Because it's child-born, it's from their perspective. And we collected 2 full days of audio from the children in our studies. And then when you feed it into the LENA software, it automatically exports some estimates of the number of adult words that children heard during the day, the number of utterances the child themselves spoke, and then the number of back and forth adult-child conversational turns. So this is anytime an adult speaks and a child responds, or a child speaks and an adult responds. And we get that throughout the day in sort of this time-varying map. And so ultimately, first we just did some basic replication. SES did seem to be related to both measures of children's language experience, including the adult words they heard, as well as the conversational turn. So this back and forth interaction. What was really interesting to me, though, is once we controlled for SES, there was no longer a correlation with the number of adult words, but there was an association between conversational turns and children's language scores. So it seemed that SES was related to children's language scores, but it seemed to be moving through conversational turns once we took SES out of the picture. And so this was kind of new at the time. We know parent-child interaction is very important, but this concept of a conversational turn was still starting to take hold. And so then I wanted to try and relate it to measures of brain development. So these children participated in MRI, and we captured measures of both structural brain development as well as functional brain development while they participated in a language processing task. And I'll tell you about the language processing task first. We shall see if the sound works. So this was a child-friendly version of an auditory language localizer, and children listened to short 15-second stories. So here's an example of one they would have heard.
Tim and his friend were playing hide and seek. Tim hid in the closet, but then he sneezed. His friend quickly found him. Tim asked if he could hide again, and his friend started counting. This time, it took a long time to find Tim.
So simple stories, things children would be familiar with. Could y'all hear that online? Hopefully. And this robustly activates a huge swath of parasylvian regions in the brain involved in language processing and auditory processing. But then we also played these stories to children backwards, and that sounds like this. She had to practice really hard for that one. So obviously you can tell that's speech, but it lacks any semantic and syntactic properties of meaningful language. So it activates a similar but non-overlapping auditory processing regions, as well as visual reasons because their eyes are open. And then when we do a simple subtraction and we compare the two, we are ultimately left with regions that do higher level language processing. And so this image on the right is the average activation across all participants in the study. And we see robust activation in essentially Wernicke's area, our superior temporal region responsible for primarily receptive language. But a different pattern seemed to emerge when we looked at individual differences in language experience. And so what we found was that the sheer number of adult words did not seem to relate to language processing uh, after we adjusted for SES, but we did find a significant correlation between the number of conversational turns children experienced and their brain activation during the language processing, specifically in Broca's area. So this is the inferior frontal lobe, typically a region involved in speech production, canonically involved in speech production. But there's a lot of recent research suggesting that it's also involved in more complex language processing, sort of deeper levels of language processing, especially syntactic information. And so this seemed to suggest that maybe they were engaging on a deeper level. To illustrate what this correlation looks like on an individual level, I'll show you the activation maps of two children circled here in green. And so these are two girls matched on SES, specifically from the lower end of the SES spectrum. And the girl on the right experienced more than twice the conversational turns of the girl on the left. And you'll see that they both exhibit extensive superior temporal activation in that core receptive region. But the difference between them is really evident in the frontal lobe, where more turns seems to relate to much greater activation. And ultimately, this then translates into very large differences in their scores on standardized language assessments. So the population mean on these assessments is 100. So the girl on the left is in the low average range. The girl on the right is doing well above average. And considering her lower SES background, she's what we would say is beating the odds. She's showing some resilience. And then ultimately we showed the same thing with white matter. So I won't belabor this point, but again, showing information from the same two girls, we see that those who have more conversational turns are showing more white matter connectivity between those two language regions. So this is a structural brain measure, not just a functional brain measure. So more conversational turns independent of SES seems to be related to greater language-based structural connectivity. And this also related to children's language skills. If we actually do a mediation analysis, we can explain about 30% of the SES effect on language using both this experiential and this neural mechanism. Since these papers were published, the findings have largely been replicated and extended by at least 6 different research groups in multiple countries using a variety of neuroimaging methods. So I use MRI, but I've seen this research sort of replicated in the EEG space using structural and functional measures of the brain. And with a variety of ages too. So for children ages 6 months to 9 years, I think. And so it suggests, all of this work is suggesting that conversational turns seems to be what is linking socioeconomic status to differences in the language brain. But again, this is all cross-sectional work. Mine was cross-sectional work. I showed you, about bringing us back to this model, I showed you some evidence of all 3 of these relationships, but being cross-sectional work, we can't make causal claims. And so I love this quote: if you truly want to understand something, you have to try and change it. And so this is what sort of guided the next part of the study was if we're able to systematically alter the linguistic input that children receive, do we then see downstream effects on language and neural development? And so to do this, we conducted an RCT with a partially overlapping sample from the previous studies, but this time all families from lower SES backgrounds. We did this in partnership with a number of community organizations, and we created a cultural adaptation of an intervention that was family-based. It consisted of interactive small groups with parents, and a separate group for children. There were many topics covered, but one core topic was on what was called meaningful language. It incorporated aspects of parental responsiveness and specific noticing of child activities, question use, and increased turn taking. And truthfully, we didn't know if this would work because remember, these children are 4 to 6 years old. So they've been parented for quite some time, right? And so we were somewhat happily surprised, did this just die? To see that it was effective at the group level. So we did find a significant intervention effect of conversational turns. The intervention group showed on average a slight decrease. The control group actually showed a decrease over time. We think this might have had to do with the time of year we were doing the study. But then, of course, we wanted to really try and see if this was related to neurodevelopment. And although we didn't find any group differences longitudinally, we did see a dose response relationship. So the magnitude of change in conversational turns correlated with physical growth, cortical thickening in 2 main regions of the brain. The first was our Broca's area region that we saw before in the inferior frontal gyrus. Interestingly, it extended into parts of the frontal lobe that are particularly involved in executive functioning. And so this got me thinking about the fact that conversation does involve executive functioning, especially with a preschooler, right? You have the working memory of keeping the previous conversation in your mind. You have the inhibition of waiting till it's your turn to talk, especially true with preschoolers. So we started thinking, oh, that seems to be part of the conversational story, maybe. And then we also saw change in a region of the supramarginal gyrus that is also involved in receptive language processing, but is also canonically involved in social processing, social cognition, and theory of mind. And so this seems to be, just hypothesizing, this seems to be about the social component of conversation, right? When I'm conversing with someone, we're sharing our minds with each other, right? And so this full pattern of plasticity may be indicative of this comprehensive set of the linguistic, executive, and social aspects of communication development. In terms of behavior, we did see that same dose response relationship in children's cognition. So we did see that changes in conversational turns did relate to increases in children's language scores and additionally increases in their executive functioning scores. Unfortunately, we didn't have a measure of social cognition. That wasn't on my radar at the time. But we're in ongoing studies, we're starting to include measures of theory of mind with these children too, to see if those are related as well. This pattern was explained by the cortical plasticity in those regions. This has gotten me really interested in the relationship between language and executive functioning. And so sort of a brief aside, I've recently extended this work to look more closely at this language EF relationship. Sorry to show you a terrible structural equation model. Don't worry about it. It's all over here. Ultimately, I had access to an incredible data set, longitudinal data set of preschoolers and their language and executive functioning skills over time. And what we ultimately found is that while there are bidirectional influences between language and executive functioning, so language supports EF, EF supports language, early in preschool development, language seems to more strongly predict EF than vice versa. So it seems to be a core foundation. And then actually, if we look at the SES differences in executive functioning over time, they are explained by SES differences in language development. So the executive functioning area of, especially in the SES literature, is huge. There's dozens of interventions to work on executive functioning skills for children from low-income backgrounds. And so one area this suggests is potentially language might be an avenue in. And so possibly. I'm not doing any more intervention work. It takes too much time. So the current extension we're doing, we're almost done with data collection. Thank God it's taken so long, is to try and bring this into a holistic model, trying to look at language development, executive functioning, and social cognition in relation to SES and brain development. But what I'm really interested in doing now is asking what the heck is a conversational turn? And so breaking down this language input into dimensions. And so with a colleague, Meredith Rowe, she has this model thinking about language input in 3 dimensions. The linguistic dimension, what are the words being said, the vocab, the syntax. An interactive social dimension, so turn taking, social cognition, and then a conceptual dimension of what is actually being said. Are you talking about something in the here and now, like this water bottle, which is conceptually pretty superficial, or are you talking about something more conceptually difficult, something from the past, something that is abstract? And so we have some preliminary data to suggest that conceptual pieces of language input seem to be more related to the development of executive functioning, which makes sense. It's abstract goal-directed behavior. Whereas interactive dimensions of language input seem to be related to all of it. So conversation seems to be important. Oh, and just briefly, I have an incredible postdoc, Alexis, who's then extending this to bilingual families and looking explicitly about the sociolinguistic environment and how that may moderate aspects of this relationship. And she's got a paper coming out soon, so that's exciting. I'll bring us back to this model. So far I've shown you everything in this sort of linear trajectory, right? Socioeconomic SES inequality affects your day-to-day experiences, affects your brain development, affects your language and literacy development. And this is a valid approach. However, it can inadvertently imply one interpretation of this data. It can inadvertently imply that higher SES participants may exhibit better cognitive skills because they are recruiting more or better neural processing resources than lower SES children, who then exhibit deficits in this processing. And that is one interpretation of the data. Another possibility is that lower SES participants are potentially recruiting less of the canonical neural systems that we typically see in higher SES individuals, but they simultaneously may be recruiting alternative neural systems. So in this way, SES acts as a moderator of the brain cognition relationship. And so if we look at this pattern, then we wouldn't necessarily say that they're deficits, we would just say that they're differences, different ways of processing. And so this is largely what has driven sort of the next area of my research. With a student, Victoria, and a colleague, Maya, we're almost ready to submit a meta-analysis where we've reviewed more than 20 studies in the SES neuroscience realm, finding these types of moderating relationships where SES children from lower SES children are recruiting different neurocognitive resources to achieve success in multiple domains. And so we see that in the area of language and literacy, we see it in the area of executive functioning, reasoning, math, and even academic achievement as a whole. And so there seems to be moderations in the magnitude of association, the directionality of association, which is like this true double dissociation, and then even the regions of the brain that children are relying on. And so this has really sort of motivated the next set of studies where I'll focus a little bit more on reading and reading disorders. Because reading and literacy really form the foundation for success in a number of later academic outcomes. So just a little brief background on reading disability, or RD as I'll call it. It's the most prevalent learning disability. It affects somewhere between 5 and 10% of school children. I've seen estimates as high as like 17%. I think it's a little closer to 5 to 10. And it is strongly correlated with children's oral language skills. So those skills we're measuring in preschool. We also see that children with reading disabilities have robust differences in brain structure and function, and these differences predate reading onset. So they do seem to be biological differences and not exclusively environmental differences. Interestingly, lower SES children are at disproportionately greater risk of reading disability. There's probably a number of reasons for this. And then there's also some really fascinating gene by environment data suggesting that in lower SES children with reading disabilities, the influence of the environment is higher than in higher SES individuals, where the influence of genetics is higher. And so this got me very interested in looking at socioeconomic status and reading disability together. Typically, they're looked at separately because we want to control, but I wanted to look at them together. And so this is a project done in collaboration with Joanna Christodoulou. She's at the Mass General Hospital. And we had a group of 65 children with reading disability, all in first or second grade, from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds. And we had an oversubscribed intervention for 40 students were assigned to receive an intensive summer reading intervention. It was a multi-sensory training of different aspects important to literacy, over 100 hours of instruction in 6 weeks, so very intensive. And then the rest of the students were assigned to a waiting control group. They had their summer as usual, and then would receive the intervention in the fall after we did all our follow-up measures. And when we look at the pre to post differences in reading scores, we did see a group effect. The intervention group on average maintained their scores. They're on the right side, while the control group exhibited a significant score decrease. And this may sound concerning at first, but recall this took place during the summer. And there's a well-documented effect called the summer slump or the summer slide, in which lower income children and children with learning disabilities tend to lose ground in the summer, while children from more advantaged backgrounds tend to gain ground during the summer through enriching activities. And so it seemed that we were able to prevent the summer slump in the intervention group. But I really want to unpack this average. I'm an individual differences person. And so what we did is we looked at the individual variation in treatment response. So this is just a histogram of children's change scores on the reading assessments. So 0 is no change, positive is improvement, negative is decrease. And you'll see that every student in the control group showed some level of decrease, while children in the intervention group might have shown an increase or a decrease. And so if we split them right at a change score of 0, and we refer to these as treatment responders and treatment non-responders, and we look at what predicts whether you're a treatment responder. We looked at a number of factors, and the only significant predictor was SES, but in the opposite direction from what we predicted. Actually, our lower SES children were more likely to be treatment responders than our higher SES children. And even after we controlled for baseline SES differences, so that those baseline differences, we see that lower SES was again associated with greater improvement under these circumstances. And then ultimately, when we looked at the pattern of neuroplasticity, we saw the same effect. So within the intervention group, lower SES was associated with greater cortical growth in our canonical reading regions in the temporal lobe, as well as the homologous right hemispheric regions to our canonical reading, left hemisphere reading regions. So suggesting this may be a compensatory pattern of brain development. But my really lingering question was like, why are we seeing these SES differences in treatment response? Is it some surface level factor, like they're finally receiving high quality education, they've got one-on-one small group intervention, or is there something deeper going on there? And so it got me interested in neurocognitive heterogeneity of RD. So we expanded our sample to include an equally diverse group of typical readers and looked at how SES related to different phenotypes of RD. And so typically when we talk about reading and reading disability, we look at we look at a multitude of factors, but I'm going to highlight just two. The core deficit is usually considered phonological processing. So this is your ability to combine sounds, break apart sounds, and recognize words that are made of sounds. So for example, if I say k, at, put it all together, you would say that's cat. But another important skill is what is called rapid automatized naming, or RAN. And many children struggle with this. It's the ability to quickly recognize and name familiar orthographic and pictographic symbols. And so you look at these numbers and say 147 very quickly. And what we found was this very interesting double dissociation, where in higher SES children, reading disability was most strongly predicted by phonological awareness, this quote unquote core deficit, and less so by rapid naming. But in lower SES children, so right end of the graphs, it was the opposite. Reading disability seemed to be more strongly predicted by rapid naming. And then we ultimately found the same thing in the neural processing. So we did an fMRI task. I won't belabor it, but it's a task tapping phonological processing. Children had to press a button anytime two words in a row started with the same sound. And then a similar task for orthographic processing. So stimuli are the same, but you're doing a slightly different thing. And we saw that same sort of dissociation. So this is just the behavioral results, the task accuracy. And then this is the whole neural profile in 3 regions. I've split it across 3 regions. So as before, reading disability in higher SES children, children with reading disability showed the greatest disparities in phonological processing. And they, so in terms of task accuracy, and then we saw that pattern also in brain activation in core phonological areas. So our Broca's area and our Wernicke's area to simplify. But in our lower SES children, reading disability was most strongly predicted by disparities in orthographic activation, this visual text processing, in one of the core visual regions responsible for text processing in the fusiform gyrus, as well as in the temporoparietal region, which also does aspects of text processing. So ultimately, we're seeing this double dissociation where it looks like children from different SES backgrounds were showing different neurocognitive phenotypes of reading disorder on average. And so ultimately, when we think about the implications of this and in a translational manner, Harkening back to my clinical days, we were thinking about the fact that when we're building interventions and prevention, right, just teaching children to read from the get-go, we need to consider these individual variations and profiles and how they might be contextually and environmentally determined, or we need to understand them in context. And that this will give us the most effective way to have translational educational approaches. And so if you'll allow me my soapbox for 1 minute, most of developmental cognitive neuroscience research relies on what we call convenience samples. And these tend to be homogeneous and representationally biased research samples of primarily highly advantaged individuals, these quote unquote weird samples, right? And this can really mask important heterogeneity in the brain and cognitive development. And so if we base our understanding on these exclusively advantaged samples, it could critically hinder the translational ability of our work, specifically to help the populations that we want to help. And so that sort of leads me to my last little bit, which is where we go from here. And that's one of the things that we're starting to really think about in my lab and my work is thinking about brain development as natural variation and adaptation to context. And so we discussed this a little bit in a theory paper I wrote recently with 2 amazing graduate students, thinking about how these might be, the SES differences we see might be adaptations to differing early environments. And if development is an adaptation to one's early environment on a short time scale, could we potentially harness adaptive strengths to inform learning, to inform education? And so that's the direction we're starting to head. One way we're starting to look at neural adaptations is in neural synchrony. Everything I've shown you so far was with MRI. I'm starting to work a lot more with a neuroimaging technique called FNIRS. It's an optical technique, and it's highly mobile, which allows me to take it into the field. And so we've just wrapped data collection, me and my colleagues, Ellen, Eliza, and Elizabeth, on collecting synchrony data from children and their caregivers in community contexts. And we're looking at moment-to-moment fluctuations in neural synchrony and asking whether they might be adaptive and context dependent. So I was talking with folks today about, the research in the neural synchrony space seems to suggest that greater synchrony is always good. And that's when learning happens. But we wonder, is greater synchrony always good, for example, when a caregiver is experiencing stress? And so recognizing that all children and all dyads experience periods of higher synchrony and lower synchrony, might it be adaptive to be less synchronous at times? And so this is one approach we're starting to take in looking at time varying measures and also in community-based neuroscience. And so the theoretical paper on this topic just recently came out. I think I want to highlight the fact that we've been doing this in a really community partnership approach. So we embed ourselves in schools for a week, we do a lesson with children about the brain. We're trying to give back as much as we're taking. And so we do our data collection, and then we do a debrief on with the children and the teachers. what I taught the researchers today, and then we offer an optional professional development if teachers want. And this has been remarkably effective. We've been able to get a lot of buy-in for neuroscience from folks that typically would not want to participate in our studies. And so this has been all credit to my colleagues who have really helped pioneer this approach. And so using these community-based neuroscience approaches, we're looking at a couple of things. So the first is what I just told you about, this in preschools and daycares, we're looking at fluctuations in caregiver-child neurosynchrony, whether it's adaptive and context dependent. We had a project looking in libraries and community health centers, looking at how programming for under-resourced new parents might influence newborns' language and literacy environments. Unfortunately, this grant was just canceled. So we'll see if we can pull anything out of it. Call your congresspeople. And one we just wrapped data collection on, also in museums. Looking at how multilingualism influences the development of language in EF networks. And so we're trying out the community neuroscience approach in children's museums. And finally, I have a project in NICUs looking at natural experiments. In hospital structure and policy. So there's been a transition largely in a lot of NICU spaces to move from open bays, which are loud and chaotic and a lot of stuff going on, to private rooms. But in doing so, it also makes the environment very quiet. And so we're looking at this as a natural experiment and how changes in policy may influence language environments for preemies. So TBD. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about this, but the last thing I'll talk about is also we're working on making our measures more inclusive. So I'm happy to talk about this in discussion a little bit, but we've been trying to think a lot about how what are we measuring with our measures, right? And so I'm using largely standardized measures of language development, but are these culturally responsive in measures of language competence? And are we culturally responsive in our measures of the language environment? How might language environments differ across cultures in a way that prepares children for the culture that they'll grow up in, or not? And then also we've been working to try and improve our methods as well. So FNIRS, the methodology that I'm largely moving into the space of, is not very good with Afro-textured hair. And so with an amazing undergraduate, we've been trying to work on policy or procedures and best practices to improve our signal and ultimately make our samples more representative. And so that preprint is out as well if you are doing that kind of work. So just to conclude, we find that SES is correlated with differences in children's day-to-day experiences and brain function and structure, and disparities in cognitive and academic development. And we can reduce some of these disparities with intervention, suggesting that periods of vulnerability may also be periods of great opportunity. Simultaneously, we show that SES systematically moderates associations between the brain and cognition, indicating that there may be different neurocognitive resources at play. We think this points to potential neurocognitive adaptations to one's early environments, resulting in heterogeneous processes. And ultimately, our takeaway from this is that it doesn't seem that there is a single optimal brain, but that optimal is very context dependent. And then finally, there's a lot of room for nuance in this field, but I think we ultimately, myself included, need to be more intentional and inclusive in our methods to better understand this really interesting diversity of context-dependent learning. And so with that, I will thank my lab members, my collaborators, my funding, and thank you for listening.